Tractatus Logico-Fidemus by Dr. Alon Giladi. On the well of earth and heaven. On the words, interpretation, and meaning in rational faith.
B.1. The world is the totality of natural and abstract things and what is between them, but not what is beyond them, the reality of God. B.2. Being is subject to our thought, but not what is beyond it. B.3. Insofar as there is a reality beyond the reality of the world and which created it, then there is a boundary between them. B.4. The things and what is between them are everything that was, everything that is present, everything that will be, everything that should be, and everything that should have been in space and time. The things and what is between them are not what preceded them or what is beyond them. B.5. Everything that should be within the framework of the path to natural truth, to identification and harmony in idea and deed with being is in man, the position of man in relation to nature. B.6. Everything that should be within the framework of the path to the religious rational truth, to identification and harmony with being and with the boundary between it and the reality beyond it, is in man, man's status before God. B.7. Space and time are a priori givens in thought about being. From this point of view, there is no real importance in examining whether they are given in themselves or are a derivative of the situation between things. B.8. Being is the totality of things and what is between them that were, are, and will be in space and time, and /or, that should have been, and /or should have been. Being is described and /or explained through mental conclusions called facts. B.9. To this must be added the totality of things that were, are, and will be in space and time due to the free-willed choice of conscious things in a particular action. B.10. The totality of things in being includes, from the perspective of thought, things in being that have form in space and time that are also perceived by the senses, hereinafter, natural things, and everything that is between natural things, hereinafter, laws of nature. This totality includes the things produced by the thought of things that have consciousness that they are not, hereinafter, abstract things, and what is in between them, hereinafter, abstract laws, such as laws of logic. Abstract things and laws are perceived by definition in the human mind and not in his senses, although in practice there is no real difference in this. B.11. Everything that is in man and everything that is outside man together is everything that is in being. B.12. Man is in being. B.13. Man is part of being. B.14. In man, natural things and abstract things and what is in between them exist, but not all things and everything in between them. B.15. Since man is part of being, being creates all of man's consciousness and feeling, except for his free will that creates a new old being. B.16. Free will does not exist in a purely natural being of things and fixed laws between them, or in quantum chance, to the extent that it exists, since any such framework contradicts it by definition as will and as free. B.17. In pure theoretical reason, every exemplary interpretive thought is true for its time. Everything that is foreseen as a chance is a foreseen untruth for its time. B.18. This matter also stems from the act of mental processing on the a priori foundations of thought and the reality it absorbs for the understanding of reality. The analytical synthetic law that serves as an expression for the act of mental processing to understand being and or confront the border with the transcendent, to the extent that it exists, is necessarily true for its time until it is refuted by another analytical synthetic law, as will be explained later in this essay. B.19. Free will exists in practice only in a world of rational faith that recognizes the reality of being and the reality of God that preceded it and contains it. B.20. Free will does not exist in a being without God, since in a deterministic being, all things are subject to fixed laws, and a free will that decides between possibilities known to it without any limitation of laws is not possible. B21. On the other hand, free will does not exist in a being without God, since insofar as it concerns a being that is wholly or partly quantum, there is no possible conscious decision that is not subject to any laws, including the existence of chance. B.22. All natural things in being are composed of fundamental parts that are a priori to interpretation and what is between them. All natural things in being and what is between them are defined in human thought according to their place in relation to each other, that is, in space, in time, and in relation to fundamental parts that are different from them, and or from their composition. B.23. All abstract things are derived from natural things that are capable of producing abstract things, and whose basis is, necessarily, a priori fundamental parts and what is between them, which are defined according to their place in space and time, and in relation to fundamental parts that are different from them, and or from their composition. B.24. Therefore, all abstract things that seek to identify with the world are necessarily subject to the same laws to which the things that produce them are subject. Being creates consciousness. Therefore, abstract things are not subject to these laws at all. Being creates consciousness, insofar as the things that produce them act out of free will and do not seek to identify with being. Consciousness creates being. B.25. Free will allows one to choose between options, since its freedom is not subject to any laws in being, which otherwise is not free and is not a choice. It follows from this that the products of thought with free will can be the product of action within the framework of laws that are subject to the laws of being, and can be the product of action that is not subject to them. B.26. Consequently, all absorption of thought in the process of creating abstract things is subject to the laws of being. Therefore, all processing and creation of thought are subject to the laws of being, insofar as they are based on the desire of the thinkers to identify with being in an exemplary manner. That is, it is interpretive thought. Therefore, all processing and creation of thought are not subject to the laws of being, insofar as they are based on thought that seeks to create a new old being in a sublime manner. That is, it is a meaningful thought. B.27. The laws of nature are where laws whose expressions the human being is a model of thought that is created by thought in order to identify with being. It follows that the human expression of the laws of nature is subject to the laws of being, insofar as they exist, but at the same time is not identical to them by definition, due to the limitation of thought in relation to the being that includes it, and is distinct from the interpretive creation about it. B.28. The laws of abstract logical thought are exemplary laws that were created by thought in order to identify with abstract things and what is in between. The laws of abstract logical thought identify with the abstract products of thought that is part of the total and general being. B.29. Therefore, the human expressions of the laws of nature are included in the human expressions of the laws of logic. Hence, there are no laws of nature that are not logical, and on the other hand, there are laws of logic that are not laws of nature. B.30. On the other hand, the creation that seeks meaning is not subject to the laws of nature, but integrates with them, and at the same time creates a being in itself. B.31. Therefore, the human creation from the realm of meaning is not subject to the laws of nature and logic, but its transcendence seeks harmony with them. B.32. Moreover, since free will is not subject to the laws of being, the sublime choice between the possibilities is not subject in itself to the laws of nature, but rather integrates with them, and at the same time creates a new old being. B.33. What the laws of nature and the laws of logic have in common is the model, the constant rational refutation, and the constant rational correction. B.34. What human creation in the realm of meaning and the voluntary choice between options has in common is the very freedom to decide and the very equality in the freedom to decide, in contrast to the options given to the decision, and in which no equality is granted to all individuals. B.35. Therefore, the more limited the options for decision are, the narrower the space for freedom to decide, and the space for equality in the freedom to decide is, and vice versa. B.36. All natural and abstract things, and everything in between, including all natural and abstract laws, are absorbed in complexity and understood in rational thought towards simplicity. B.37. Pure simplicity is absorption without processing and creation. B.38. Pure exegesis is absorption with processing and creation that approach identification with being, / the implications of the limit in being. B.39. The simple is always complex, while the exemplary sermon is always simple. B.40. The rational and exemplary path to simplicity necessarily passes through complexity. B.41. The path to logical thought clarity passes through the pre-logical receptive and logical processing complexity. B.42. The path to the simple sermon passes through the complex simple. B.43. The claim that what cannot be said clearly is better not to be said is a claim lacking in definition and hence incorrect. B.44. Say from now on, what you cannot say clearly after having said it in complexity is what deserves silence. B.45. Natural facts are the fruit of interpretive thought. Natural facts are the understanding of being / is in theoretical and / or moral thought at the time. Natural facts are the understanding of things and what is between them at the time, as existing and appropriate in theoretical and moral thought. Natural facts are the understanding of being and the existential implications of the boundary at the time in rational, religious thought. B.46. Natural facts are the fruit of the creation of thought that seeks to identify with natural things and what is between them, including the laws of nature in space and time. Natural facts are the fruit of the creation of thought that seeks to identify with being and / or the implications of the boundary as they were absorbed, processed, and inferred in a rational, exemplary manner by human thought, as long as they have not been refuted by it in a rational, exemplary manner. B.47. The abstract facts are the understanding of metaphysical existence in a rational, exemplary manner by human thought, which has not been refuted by it in a rational, exemplary manner. B.48. The fundamental error of analysts, as they are, consists of the opposite approach to the complex instead of the simple, and of the fundamentally erroneous equation in favor of the means as the main thing and against the end as the foundation. B.49. And it should be emphasized, there is no understanding of the thing in itself, but only in relation to another thing, or in relation to what is between it and another thing. B.50. Observation of the thing in itself, that is, without relation to another thing, represents a sound and / or an image, but not a fact. B.51. Following Popper. Understanding in a rational, exemplary manner is thought that acts towards things that are between them through the facts it has created as refutable, subject to laws that have not been refuted and can be refuted. B.52. Understanding in a rational, exemplary manner is an exemplary thought of a type of interpretation that operates towards things and what is between them through the facts it has created as refutable. The exemplary interpretive thought operates subject to refutable laws that have not yet been refuted, and thereby seeks to maintain a fusion / clothing / identification with the truth, which by definition will never be fully achieved. B.53. The possibility of refuting any interpretive thought is built into its essence, which seeks to identify with being and / or the limit, but can never do so fully. B.54. Truth is God. It is the divine reality that is beyond being and includes the reality of being as it is in itself. B.55. In the existential view according to which the world is devoid of God, truth is the world of being / nature / being. In the theistic view, truth is God, that is, the reality beyond the world of being that includes the world of being created by it. B56. It follows that truth can never be attained by thought, whether from a starting point of being or from a starting point of God. Interpretive thought works to this end, merging with reality as it is, through mental tools found in the reality from which they were created, and therefore, in a structured way, reality cannot merge, fully merging. B.57. Man is a part of being. He was born from it and into it. He developed from it, and from within it. He is shaped by it, like anything else in the world of being, and/or theistic reality. Man also shapes being, like anything else with free will. B.58. It cannot be said that man's thought determines reality, or that the world is facts and not things. These are types of deficient understanding in a definition that is plagued by false arrogance. B.59. Every thought operates subject to the laws of nature between things, being produced by natural things and what is between them, except for the will, which is free by definition, and in this respect is beyond recognition and being. B.60. Therefore, there may be products of thought of the type of interpretation that are in the way of truth, that is, rational exemplary, and products of interpretive thought that are not in the way of truth, that is not rational exemplary. B.61. Therefore, there may be products of thought of the type of meaning that are rational and elevated in that they seek to integrate with being through the senses and a priori foundations of thought and subject, but not to identify with it. B.62. On the other hand, there may be products of thought of the type of meaning that are not subject to being, but rather create a new old being that seeks to integrate with the existing being that preceded their creation. B.63. Free will, to the extent that it exists, is part of the rational faith boundary, or of the shadow that the boundary casts in the light of rational faith on being. Free will has, on the one hand, a mental, physical/natural dimension, and on the other hand, its freedom has an extra-mental, sublime/divine dimension. B.64. Natural and abstract facts are never absolute and complete, since they depend on everything in being, which is by definition, everything in being in man and everything in being outside man that creates consciousness. They also depend on being created by the free will of all beings of consciousness, whose laws of being are not necessarily subject to being, which is different from one conscious thing to another, and cannot be predicted with certainty to complete knowledge. Being, by definition, is not entirely subject to human knowledge. B.65. Everything with consciousness has free will, insofar as free will exists. B.66. The claim that there is no connection between will and knowledge in the examination of conclusions versus decisions is fundamentally wrong. The degree of choice of the will, and hence the degree of its practical freedom, depends on the degree of choice possibilities. B.67. The degree of choice depends on the degree of consciousness. B.68. The higher the level/degree of consciousness, the greater the potential for practical freedom of will. B.69. In rational belief, everything and everything in between are included in the divine reality and are subject to the laws of being. But at the same time, in every conscious thing in being, there is something of the divine that is not subject to the laws of being. B.70. Hence, every conscious thing has the ability to create something from its will and consciousness that are not subject in themselves to the laws of being. B.71. Pure instinct is an action of a living thing that is devoid of consciousness and will. B.72. From this it follows that there is no conscious thing that acts from pure instinct, unless its consciousness and will are not in its possession. B.73. The further the actions of the conscious being move away from instinct and closer to the peak of consciousness, the greater their practical freedom of will, and vice versa. B.74. Hence also that natural and abstract facts are not being, but the product of man's thought about being. They are not the truth. They are not being, and they are not God. They are man's understanding of the world, and the limit until it is refuted. They are a conscious truth for the time being, but not the truth itself. B.75. Unrefuted conscious truth, in which rational thought operates that strives for the actual truth, is where the partial action and product of the attempt of the exemplary identification of thought with being, which has not yet been refuted. B.76. The interpretive aspect of the conscious truth for the time being is created by thought that works to adapt the product of thought with the absorption of what is in reality that can be absorbed in a manner that is subject to the laws of being and or operates according to them. B.77. Natural facts are inferred in a rational, logical manner using language. They are inferred by a descriptive and/or explanatory mental adjustment between sensory mental absorption of natural things in relation to other natural things and what is in between, and a mental interpretive processing on the a priori basis of thought and the categories in which it operates, hereinafter. Natural logical adjustment. B.78. The facts abstracted in thought of the type of interpretation are inferred in a rational logical manner using language. They are inferred by a descriptive and/or explanatory mental adjustment between sensory mental absorption of abstract things and a mental interpretive processing on the a priori basis of thought and the categories in which it operates, hereinafter. Abstract logical adjustment. B.79. The a priori basis of pure rational thought regarding the world includes, from Kant onwards, the a priori rational natural forms of space and time, and the rational categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. B.80. The categories of pure theoretical reason, hereinafter, the theoretical categories, of the quantitative type include unity, measure, and multiplicity, growth, and totality, whole. The theoretical categories of the qualitative type include actuality, negation, and limitation. The theoretical categories of the relational type include piety and subjectivity, relationship between object and case, total causality, relationship of cause and effect, and cooperation, interaction between agent and effect. The theoretical categories of the modal type include possibility and impossibility, reality and absence, and necessity and contingency. B.81. The a priori platform of pure moral reason includes the a priori theoretical natural forms of space and time, the rational ideological categories, and, in addition, the a priori moral forms and the rational moral categories that stem from them. The a priori moral forms are the individual's right, the public's right, and the relationship between them. The moral rational categories are the individual's right to life, liberty, equality, and happiness that stem from his essence, the rights of the public, and the relationship between them that strives for pure balance. B.82. The category of pure moral reason of the type of the individual's right to life includes the right to avoid harm to the individual and the individual's right to self-defense against harm. B.83. The moral category of the type of the individual's right to liberty includes the right to think, to perceive, process, and create, to speak, to legislate, to execute, and to judge freely. B.84. The category of the individual's right to equality includes the right to socio-economic/material equality, the right to equal opportunities for the realization of individual rights, the individual's right to equality in life, liberty, and happiness, and the right to equality in life, freedom, and happiness. B.85. The category of the individual's right to happiness includes the right to conceptual and practical aspiration for personal individual physical/ideal/emotional perfection, and the right to conceptual and practical aspiration for personal general physical/existential perfection for life, liberty, and equality. The category of the individual's right to happiness includes the right to freedom of will in terms of not limiting the possibilities of knowledge for the purpose of voluntary decision-making and the possibility of realizing the individual's free will. B.86. The rational moral category of the type rights of the many includes in a limited way the collection of moral categories of all human individuals, and in a comprehensive way the collection of moral categories of all individuals of existence. B.87. The rational moral category of the type of relationship between rights of the individual and rights of the many includes the aspiration for an ideal/complete/maximal point of balance between the moral categories of the right of the individual and the moral categories of the rights of the many. B.88. Moral reason operates through the a priori moral rational platform under conditions of theoretical reason, that is, an exemplary moral rational examination of the optimal point of balance between the two moral authorities, individual and plural. Pure moral reason operates in the manner of a pure process towards that pure point of balance on a specific case with specific factual data. B.89. In other words, moral reason operates in a manner of balancing between the individual's authority and the public authority on the a priori rational ideological and rational moral platform. It does so to determine what should be from the starting point of being. Pure moral reason is the status of man before the reality of being/nature/being. B.90. The a priori platform of pure religious reason includes the rational a priori forms, the theoretical and moral, and in addition to them, the a priori religious rational substance, which is the one, the only, the indefinite, and the unattainable God. B.91. This platform also includes the a priori religious rational form, which is the existence of a boundary between the unattainable reality of God and the reality of being/nature/being that was created from it and is included in it. B.92. The a priori platform of pure faith reason also includes the faith rational categories of perfect and unattainable truth that result from the existence of the boundary on its existential side, as the path of God. B.93. The faith rational categories result from an existential exemplary observation of the boundary, which are perfect singularity, perfect unity, and perfect existence, which are unattainable in themselves. The category of pure rational faith of the type of perfect singularity includes perfect freedom. The category of pure rational faith of the type of perfect unity includes perfect equality. The category of pure rational faith of the type of perfect existence includes perfect happiness and perfect action. B.94. The category of pure rational belief of the type of perfect happiness includes, in a conscious thing, the feeling of perfect peace, and in the type of perfect action, the perfect mental and physical action, the perfect do. B.95. From the perspective of man, the category of perfect existence is necessarily perfect intellectual perfection, which is perfect intellectual and intellectual sensory happiness, which creates and acts in the perfect due manner and creates in being perfect emotional happiness for the individual and all individuals alike. B.96. From the perspective of man, the category of perfect existence means the aspiration to know the world and the limit, which includes the constant aspiration for an exemplary and sublime harmony between complete freedom, equality, and happiness, and the action according to it, or, in other words, the work of God, the status of man before God. B.97. Pure rational faith is where the highest, most sublime interpretive thought of man is in a constant and never-ending rational evolutionary process. Pure rational faith operates through rational evolutionary identification with being and the limit on the a priori platform of pure rational faith and includes theoretical, moral, and religious reason together. B.98. At the same time, pure rational faith is also the highest meaningful thought that is in a creative process, free-willed, rational evolutionary, constant and never-ending, through the aspiration for rational and sublime harmony with being and the limit. B.99. Free choice is not found in deterministic existence, since, in a world where things and fixed laws exist between them, there is no freedom for things, including things with consciousness, and everything is given in advance. B.100. Free choice is not found in quantum existence, since it is based on consciousness, on conscious decision, and not on chance. B.101. Complex things with consciousness are based on things subject to fixed laws or chance, and therefore free choice is not found in purely material existence. B.102. Equality and identity are not found in deterministic material existence. The reason for this is that in a world where time, space, things, and fixed laws exist between things, no one thing is identical to another. Each thing exists at a different time or place, or under the influence of forces, or in a composition of materials in a different way than another. B.103. At the same time, in quantum existence, equality of identity is apparently possible when matter seemingly maintains the identity of a particle and a wave at the same time. Hence, equality of identity can and does exist in a being without God. B.104. On the other hand, equality between conscious things exists solely on the basis of the free will that is necessarily found in them equally, and this only within the framework of rational faith. B.105. Happiness as perfection, in terms of completing deficiencies in identity, is not found in deterministic material existence, since it necessarily maintains an infinity of things that are divided into infinity in a way that is different from the influence of the whole world on the other thing with which the conscious thing seeks to maintain perfection in identity. B.106. In quantum existence, which seemingly maintains randomness and uncertainty, there is a contradiction to the possibility of a state of perfect happiness, which maintains within it an assumption of certainty and permanence. B.107. At the same time, since equality and identity are possible in quantum being, then metaphysically there is a possibility of completeness in primary units in being in a unity of the kind of identity between spirit and matter, or in the parallel identity between idea and deed, or between thought and thing, although, as stated, it does not maintain the foundations of certainty and permanence. B.108. However, it seems that the quantum world, with its theoretical contingency and the theoretical identity between the particle and the wave in it, are found in primary things and not in complex things in relation to other complex things. B.109. The interpretive idea that arises from thought is a product of complex things, perhaps the most complex in being, and so is the interpretive act derived from it, which in their complex essence are not given by definition to the same identity to which primary particles may or may not be given. B.110. In practice, the only perfection that maintains certainty and stability that is conceivable in a deterministic or quantum being without God is the very existence of being itself as a whole. This is because, insofar as being is not renewed, it is apparently certain and permanent and has no deficiencies whatsoever, or, in the language of rational faith, "And the heavens and the earth were finished, and God rested from all his work which he had made." B.111. However, this alleged perfection of being does not indicate the completeness of the deficiencies of the conscious thing. It is not consistent with quantum being, and is not consistent with theoretical reason itself, since nothing, whether it is a particle or a wave, is not created deterministically from nothing. B.112. Moreover, material being by definition does not maintain identity with the being that preceded it and created it, which otherwise would be the same permanent being. Hence, it cannot be said that being in itself maintains perfection, since it by definition lacks the reality that preceded it and contained it. B.113. Therefore, the freedom to choose between observation as spirit or matter and the identity between spirit and matter suggests that happiness as a completion in being is possible only from this rational faith, since free choice exists only in it. Only rational faith, as distinct from theoretical, moral reason, can by definition unite in free choice between spirit and matter, between idea and fact, between interpretive thought and its identification with being, and meaningful thought and its harmony with the being that preceded it. B.114. Hence also, the action of the proper act towards the absolute good is not found in purely material being, since the decision between possibilities is necessarily given to conscious freedom of choice, and there is no conscious freedom of choice in purely being. B.115. Moreover, the very existence of the deed proper to the absolute good that stems from the purpose of things is not found in deterministic existence, since it, as a mechanical mechanism of things and fixed laws between them, does not hold any possibility of choice. Deterministic existence contradicts the existence of free will, which is the basis of the choice between what is proper to do and what is not proper. Therefore, a deed proper as an absolute good does not exist in deterministic existence. B.116. In practice, a deterministic view is supposed to assert that the absolute good is existence itself, in which there is no good or evil, since the totality of things is fixed, and the laws between them are fixed. B.117. However, empirically, we know that a thing with form does not always progress towards its purpose, especially when a conscious thing sometimes decides to act in a way that is contrary to its natural purpose. Moreover, the purpose of existence as a whole is to exist, while things themselves, including conscious things, never exist as they are, but change constantly and at every given moment. B.118. On the other hand, in quantum existence, there is no free choice whatsoever, which is a matter of free voluntary consciousness that does not exist in the primary particles and is not consistent with the principle of chance. In any case, by analogy, in quantum or deterministic existence, there is no good and evil in everything that concerns the existence or non-existence of things according to their purpose. B.119. Indeed, in the view that there is no universal right, but only a universal existing, there is no place for the dialectic of evil and good, but only for truth and falsehood. But this view is rejected in rational faith out of a combined observation of the purpose and form of things, of the free will of conscious things, and of the existence of the eternal truth that has no equal. B.120. Free choice, conscious equality as identity, happiness as conscious perfection between spirit and matter, and the right act as absolute good are not found in being except in the religious rational being, and here too, from the perspective of man, they constitute part of his aspiration and not his attainment. B.121. Theoretical reason, moral reason, and religious reason operate in their most developed essence known to the rational man through language. B.122. Human language is a composition of natural human sounds created by the power of human speech, symbolized by images and used for thought and communication between an individual and other human beings, and between himself. B.123. Every human being, by definition, has an internal language between himself that is not shared and cannot be shared in its entirety with others, and at the same time maintains a priori and a posteriori common elements between him and others. B.124. Man is never truly alone. Man is always within and in front of being, and maintains intellectual and sensory reciprocal relations with it, and/or with the boundary. This stems from his very essence as a human being, who is part of being and/or of the divine reality that includes it. B.125. Man is never alone. When Jacob is left alone, he is struggling with man. When Moses ascends the mountain alone, he is with the supreme, rational, faithful being and confronts the divine reality through the boundary. Man is never left alone. B.126. The foundation of human language is in natural fundamental sounds produced by man, or in fundamental images that symbolize the natural fundamental sounds produced by man, such as letters, characters. B.127. The fundamental sounds or images of fundamental sounds in human language, or fundamental images in language, are the a priori components in human language. That is, they are not in themselves subject to interpretation within its framework. B.128. Human thought is natural operations in the human brain, and it is expressed empirically through the action of billions of his brain cells and nerve/electrical oscillations between them, and constitutes an inseparable part of things and what is between them. Human thought includes communication within and outside of itself, and also includes conscious and unconscious voluntary brain commands, and even commands that are not voluntary. B.129. Thought, from an observational perspective, is an action of the things found in the human brain, which include billions of cells and everything in between. Therefore, from this perspective, it is subject to the rules to which the things that create it, found in the human brain, are subject, insofar as they exist in general, and in the thought process in particular. B.130. Thought, from a voluntary mental perspective, is an action whose meaning of freedom is not subject to human knowledge, since insofar as it is free, it exceeds the laws of nature to which human beings are subject as part of being. B.131. Human language is not identical to human thought. B.132. Human language constitutes a means of conscious voluntary thought expression and, in general, of conscious voluntary communication of man, but by definition, there is no identity between it and thought itself, but rather a partial partnership. B.133. Language as a collection of basic sounds produced by man, or as a collection of basic sound images, or as a collection of basic images produced by man's thought, is not in itself a photograph of the world, but a partial expression of absorption from being, / the world of being, and the processing of thought regarding this absorption. B.134. The intellectual processing of the absorbed being can and will take two forms: interpretive processing on the intellectual a priori platform, expressed mainly in language, and meaningful processing on the intellectual a priori platform and the sensory intellectual a priori platform, expressed in creation and in language. B.135. No conclusions can be drawn from language itself about being, or even about thought itself. B.136. The foundation of language is an agreement between people and / or between a person himself about basic sounds or images, which is not subject to interpretation within its framework. B.137. Therefore, the basic sounds and / or basic images are the agreed-upon a priori components of language, as opposed to the a priori elements inherent in human thought itself. B.138. The combination of the basic sounds and / or basic images of language is subject to interpretation within the framework of language, since it exceeds the a priori agreement of language. B.139. The combinations of the a priori elements of language are roughly divided into combinations that sustain natural / physical, formal images that are not descriptions, combinations that sustain natural / interpretive descriptions, combinations that sustain natural, meaningful descriptions, combinations that sustain interpretive explanations, and combinations that sustain natural, meaningful creation. B.140. The combinations of a priori elements are also divided into combinations that maintain abstract images that are not descriptions, combinations that maintain abstract interpretive descriptions, combinations that maintain abstract interpretive explanations, combinations that maintain abstract meaningful descriptions, combinations that maintain abstract meaningful creation, and combinations between natural combinations and abstract combinations and their types. B.141. In practice, every meaningful description and creation maintains abstract combinations in language, in contrast to interpretive thought, which maintains both natural combinations and abstract combinations in language, and sometimes combined combinations. B.142. In detail, it can be said that the a priori combinations of the elements of language are divided into Combinations that maintain images and symbols as a result of the thought's absorption of the external being to man, or the absorption of the inner being of man, and are not descriptions or explanations. Hereinafter, natural element combinations. Combinations that maintain meaningful descriptions as a processing of the absorption of thought that are not explanations or interpretive descriptions and are not images. Hereinafter, descriptive meaningful language combinations. Combinations that maintain interpretive descriptions as a processing of the absorption of thought. Hereinafter, descriptive interpretive language combinations. Combinations that maintain interpretive explanations of the relationship between the pictorial element combinations absorbed by thought. Hereinafter, explanatory interpretive language combinations. For combinations that represent abstract images and symbols, that is, that are not the result of the mind's absorption of natural things, but of abstract things, and are neither descriptions nor explanations. Hereinafter, abstract element combinations. For combinations that represent abstract interpretive descriptions of natural or abstract element combinations. Hereinafter, abstract descriptive interpretive combinations. For combinations that represent abstract meaningful descriptions of natural or abstract element combinations. Hereinafter, abstract meaningful descriptive combinations. For combinations that represent abstract interpretive explanations of natural element combinations and the relationship between them. For combinations that represent abstract interpretive explanations of abstract element combinations and the relationship between them. For combinations that represent meaningful works regarding natural or abstract element combinations and the relationship between them. B.143. The a priori elements of language, the natural elements of language, and its abstract elements, as well as all language combinations, have meaning by definition. B.144. Meaning in language is a person's mental insight into things or what is between things, as expressions in the basic combinations of language and the relationship between them. Meaning is beyond the a priori nature of the elements of language, or beyond the natural and or abstract basic combinations of language, or beyond the interpretive descriptions and explanations in relation to natural and or abstract basic combinations and any relationship between them. Meaning in language does not seek to identify with basic combinations of language or with combinations that describe or interpret in language a perceived being, but to integrate with being through them, and through the a priori intellectual, sensory and intellectual elements of thought of their types. B.145. Meaning in language is not a description or an interpretive explanation of being, but rather a description and or creation that seeks to integrate with the being subject to interpretation and, in fact, to create a new being with it that is subject to a new interpretation. B.146. The existence of meaning in language is learned, among other things, from the fact that language is not in itself, but is a product of thought that is not identical to it. B.147. All those who see meaning as part of interpretation are on the path of fundamental error. B.148. Meaningful thought is not a structure of interpretation as part of it, but rather the creation of thought. Unlike interpretive thought, it does not seek to identify with being, but to integrate with it in a way that changes it. B.149. The interpretive creation seeks to identify with being and is in fact created by it. B.150. The meaningful creation seeks to integrate with the being towards which it acts, and at the same time to create a new being that integrates the being before the creation with the creation. B.151. Meaning is separate from interpretation, and both complement each other towards the higher reason in relation to being, or towards the higher faith-based reason in relation to being, and the limit, towards the truth that will never be achieved. B.152. The very act of establishing a certain sound as an element in language has a meaning that is beyond language. The very act of attaching a letter to a certain sound in language has a meaning that is beyond language. The very act of combining the a priori elements of language with symbols or images in language has a meaning that is beyond language in itself. B. 153. I call a thing that I perceive as having a form in space and time, such as a table, and thus I give a sensuous intellectual meaning to this thing that goes beyond attaching the linguistic combination to the image that I perceive purely as an a priori datum of language. B. 154. The things are true even if that name is not connected on the surface, from the language itself, with the essence/form of the material to which I give a name, a matter that is subject to dispute in itself and to interpretive examination. B. 155. Although I can give a different name to this image in a different language, and I can understand the same name/image in the same language in different ways, in relation to its relations with other element combinations, etc., the very act of giving a name by human thought to some perceived image of things, and what is between them, contains an insight into meaning. B. 156. The same is true of the a priori elements of language. The very fact that I give a certain sound a fundamental status in language, or give it a symbolic expression, necessarily preserves a meaning for that sound or symbolic expression that is beyond the framework of language. B. 157. Interpretation seeks truth. Interpretation seeks exemplary transcendence. Meaning does not seek truth. Meaning seeks creative transcendence. B. 158. When meaning is from the irrational realm, it necessarily includes the elements that are not shared by the rational individual's thought with being in general, and with the thought of all individuals in the exemplary sense in particular, and even with regard to what is beyond being. B. 159. Irrational meaning does not seek to integrate with being through the a priori elements of thought as a subject. It seeks to integrate with reality through the senses alone, or mainly, or it does not seek to integrate with being at all. B. 160. Non-sensuous meaning, that is, that it seeks to integrate with being through the a priori elements of thought alone, or that it seeks to integrate with being not through the a priori elements of thought and not through the senses, or that it does not seek to integrate with reality at all. B. 161. Rational interpretation, that is, that it seeks to identify with being and/or the limit through the a priori elements of thought. Exemplary rational interpretation, that is, that it seeks to do so in a way that can be refuted and has not yet been refuted. B. 162. Irrational interpretation, that is, that it seeks to identify with being and/or the limit through the a priori elements of thought, such as through the senses, or that it does not seek to identify with being at all, or it seeks to identify with being in a way that cannot be refuted or in a way that has been refuted. B. 163. A formal rational conclusion to the meaning of the natural and descriptive semantic element combinations in themselves, in language itself, is a matter of axiomatic agreement between people and not a matter of interpretation. B. 164. It is possible for one word to have several meanings, but it is not possible without the context with other words to claim the correct meaning in relation to being. B. 165. Wind is air flowing from a barometric level to a barometric depression, or thought distinct from matter. But without the context with other words, it is not possible to determine what the correct meaning of the product of interpretive thought in the language in question is. B. 166. An informal/substantive conclusion regarding the meaning of the natural and abstract element combinations in a language is subject to interpretation in an exemplary way of proof or refutation according to their location and context within the framework of all combinations in the language as they are. B. 167. Moreover, an informal/substantive conclusion regarding the meaning of the combinations of the a priori elements of the language in the language itself is a matter of interpretation, proof or refutation in the relationship between the location of the a priori elements of the language and between the specific and general framework of the language in which they are given in relation to being. B. 168. Both the a priori elements of the language and their combinations are subject to infinite meaning by virtue of being subject to a meaning beyond the framework of the language and to a meaning within the language itself, being the product of a thought that is not the same as thought. This also stems from the fact that semantic thought is part of the world and is not identical to the world/being, and does not seek to identify with being/boundary, but rather to serve with them in harmony. B. 169. A basic combination of those a priori language elements can sometimes be used in a different sense in the same language, and, to a certain extent, will be used in a different sense between different languages. B. 170. A conclusion in language to the interpretive meaning of the natural and descriptive basic combinations in language is a mental identification with those absorbed basic combinations in relation to their pictorial/descriptive/explanatory meaning towards other basic combinations and/or being through new basic combinations that are the product of an interpretive processing of the absorbed combinations. B. 171. A conclusion to the interpretive meaning of a descriptive expression or interpretive explanations means the desire to identify with it and with the being that includes it. B. 172. Conclusion regarding the interpretation of a meaningful descriptive or creative expression, the desire to identify with it and with the new being created in its place is inherent. B. 173. Therefore, a superior interpretation of a meaningful work, ka, entails a processing of the absorption of the work and the new being created in it on the a priori intellectual rational platform of the interpreter, and a processing of the product of the processing of the absorption of the previous being on the a priori intellectual visual and intellectual sensory platform of the creator, in accordance with the type of work. B. 174. The total mental transcendence harbors in itself common elements of sensory perception, of being, and of the processing of the perceived being through the a priori intellectual rational platform, and separate elements of the perception of being on the a priori intellectual sensory platform. B. 175. Meaning is not interpretation. B. 176. Meaning is thought that seeks to maintain harmony with the world/being and with the perceived/preceding boundary, but not merging with them. B. 177. Meaning is thought that seeks to maintain harmony with being and with the perceived/preceding boundary through the a priori elements of thought for its subject. B. 178. The external being to man is perceived by thought through the senses. B. 179. The absorption of being is processed by interpretive thought through the a priori elements of interpretive thought in its various forms, and the production of an interpretive creation in order to identify with the being absorbed. B. 180. The absorption of being is processed by meaningful thought through the a priori conceptual and sensory elements of thought, and the production of a meaningful creation that seeks to integrate with being, that is, to create a new old being. B. 181. Harmony of meaning with the world is the desire for integration, /calm, /sense of completion, and intellectual rational perfection of thought with the world and /or the boundary. B. 182. Harmony in a meaningful way includes, for example, the teachings of preventing suffering and pain through thought, from the rational aspiration for nirvana, enlightenment, revelation from a rational focus on the senses, and not from the search for truth. B. 183. Harmony in a meaningful way includes, for example, the works of painters and sculptors, poets, writers, and composers. B. 184. In a pure way that does not exist in reality, pure interpretive thought is in the sense of being that creates consciousness, while pure meaningful thought is consciousness that creates being. Being changes. The boundary is fixed. B. 185. In practice, thought moves between the two ideal poles of two issues, that is, between consciousness that creates being and between being that creates consciousness. B. 186. In practice, therefore, every voluntary thought and practical action, whether it is meaningful or interpretive, necessarily combines being that creates consciousness and consciousness that creates being. B. 187. In the act of interpretive thought, the degree of influence of being on consciousness is greater in a structured way than in the act of meaningful thought, in which the degree of influence of consciousness on being is greater. B. 188. In practice, the closer the interpretive thought approaches the truth, the less the influence of being on it decreases, since it approaches unity with the being with which it seeks to identify, which will never be achieved. B. 189. The further the interpretive thought moves away from the truth, the less the influence of being on it, since it moves away from unity with the being with which it seeks to identify. B. 190. The more elevated the meaningful thought, the more it moves away from identification with the being that preceded it, and at the same time, it has a greater effect on changing that being towards a new old being that includes both the previous and the meaningful creation. B. 191. The distancing of interpretation from the path of truth changes being due to its influence on volitional thought and volitional action from the erroneous possibilities it presents to them in the fallacy of its identification with being. B. 192. The distancing of interpretive thought from truth actually creates a meaningful thought that is not in harmony with being. It moves away from integration with being and approaches the lower, irrational, meaningful thought. B. 193. The distancing of interpretive thought from exemplary identification with the being with which it seeks to identify ranges between interpretive reliance on the senses or on the a priori sensory intellectual platform and the absence of reliance on the a priori intellectual rational platform. B. 194. In the voluntary choice of action following both types of thought, the degree of influence of consciousness on being is greater than the influence of being on consciousness. B. 195. Before man, there are 7 types of thought and action through language: pictorial thought and meaningful action, interpretive thought and meaningful action, interpretive thought and meaningful action, meaningful thought and meaningful action, meaningful thought and meaningful action, interpretive thought and action that is neither interpretive nor meaningful, meaningful thought and action that is neither meaningful nor meaningful. B. 196. Every thought that necessarily involves processing is a voluntary thought, and every action that follows the absorption of being is a voluntary action. B. 197. In the 7 types of thought and action, there is a difference in the degree of influence of being on consciousness compared to the degree of influence of being on consciousness. B. 198. The religious rational doctrine of names in the Torah is a model interpretation and at the same time the creation of a religious rational being as a lofty, meaningful thought, in contrast to a mystical doctrine of names that is not lofty thought and is even found at the lower pole of meaning or interpretation by its very essence. B. 199. The reading of names in itself contains the obligation to give meaning to their object. A person perceives an object in being with his senses and creates a name for it out of the desire to be with it and with the whole of being and / or the boundary in both sensory rational harmony. B. 200. The reading of the names in a faith-rational manner serves in a meaningful way to metaphorically transcend, within the framework of a sublime text, to understand the status of man before God, since it incorporates a call to a sublime rational faith already in its foundations. B. 201. Here, the interpretive element joins the reading of the names, since at the same time, the faith-rational doctrine of the names contains an interpretation in the sense that the giving of the names constitutes a basis for mental identification with the object of being perceived by it through the senses. B. 202. The faith-rational interpretation of the names in an exemplary manner is as identification with their meaningful essence and the new old being created for them, both within the framework of the text in which they are found, and in relation to the being that includes them and which the names have changed and are constantly changing through their renewed interpretation. B.203. The reading of a priori names or natural elements in language, such as giving a letter to a sound, a name image to an object in existence, etc., is in itself an interpretation of existence at its lowest pole, since the foundation of the search for truth is found in it at a low level. The mere correspondence of a name to an object in existence does not indicate any truth other than that of the existence of that image in language and of the existence of meaningful thought towards that object. B.204. The reading of names or the giving of images to the object of thought through language inherently contains some truth, since it in itself constitutes a creation of mental identification with a shared personal and general meaning through language towards an object of thought. The reading of names within the framework of interpretive or meaningful thought of their types inherently contains a higher meaning towards that object of thought. B.205. Hence, the reading of names in itself is the creation of meaning for things and what is between them, and it is in itself the creation of being. It is consciousness that creates being. B.206. Meaning and interpretation are an object. They are a thing created by thought that is a thing. B.207. Interpretation about meaning is an aspiration to identify with the meaningful creation as part of the new old being that it created, and at the same time with the new old being as a whole. Interpretation about meaning includes examining the depth of harmony that meaning maintains with being and/or the boundary through the a priori sensory elements common to the creator, the interpreter, and all human beings, and the a priori intelligent elements of thought common to all human beings. B.208. A deeper, meaningful thought is a thought that maintains a more exemplary, rational, intellectual connection, as opposed to identification, with the materials of which it is composed, with other works of its kind, with all meaningful works, and with all being and/or the limit. B.209. A deeper, meaningful thought is a thought that maintains a deeper intellectual sensory connection with the a priori sensory intellectual elements of all things with consciousness, and with all being and/or the limit. B.210. A higher meaning is a meaning that maintains a more exemplary, rational connection with the materials of which it is composed, with other works of its kind, and/or with all works, and with all being and/or the limit. B.211. The creation of meaningful thought ranges between a depth of approaching complete rational harmony with all the materials of which it is composed, with other works of its kind, and with the whole of being and/or the boundary, and approaching the absence of any rational harmony with them. The two intellectual poles of the creation of meaningful thought do not exist in practice. The first is not a concept, and the second is impossible. B.212. The product of meaningful thought ranges between a pole of complete sensory/emotional and intellectual integration of the meaningful work with the being that preceded it through, and an emotional or intellectual integration only with the being that preceded it, or the absence of any integration with it. B.213. Theoretically, it is possible to examine the degree of integration of meaningful thought with being by comparing the being that preceded the meaningful work with the new old being that was created after it and includes it. B.214. The intellectual rational and sensory emotional connection between the product of meaningful thought and being and/or the boundary maintains some kind of relationship whose highest and unattainable conceptual end is complete harmony between the previous being and the new old being created as a result of this product. B.215. The intellectual, rational connection between the product of meaningful thought and being and/or the boundary maintains a superior intellectual relationship of an exemplary causal connection with the materials from which it is made, with works of its kind, and with the being that preceded it. This connection can and does exist, of a type of continuity or of opposition or of completion. It can and does exist of a type of exemplary quality of multiplicity or union, vis-a-vis works of its kind, and vis-a-vis being. It can and does exist of an exemplary modality of a type of necessity or contingency, in relation to works of its kind and in relation to being. And it can and does exist of a type of exemplary quality of limitation or negation or reality, in relation to works of its kind and being. These relationships between the intellectual, rational dimension of the meaningful thought and the being and/or the boundary are observable, measurable, and therefore interpretable. B. 216. The intellectual, sensory, emotional connection between the product of the sublime, meaningful thought and the being and/or the boundary maintains a sublime, emotional/sensory relationship that, on the way to its harmonious pole, causes calm, fulfillment, pain relief, enlightenment, and transcendence. On the other hand, the distancing of the sublime, meaningful thought from the boundary and/or the being creates a feeling of unease, pain, depression, or perhaps indifference that is combined in a sensory, physical, and an emotional, intellectual way. B. 217. The sensory intellectual connection of the meaningful thought with the absorbed and new old being is not measurable or identifiable, unlike the rational emotional connection, but rather for interpretive evaluation only. On the one hand, it involves elements common to all observers and is the elements of their a priori natural senses. And on the other hand, it involves individual, understandable elements known only to them, if at all, of both the intellectual and physical level of sensation. B. 215. The intellectual rational connection between the product of meaningful thought and being and/or the boundary maintains a superior intellectual relationship of an exemplary causal connection with the materials from which it is made, with works of its kind, and with the being that preceded it. This connection can and does exist of a type of continuity or of opposition or of completion. It can and does exist of a type of exemplary quality of multiplicity or union, vis-a-vis works of its kind and vis-a-vis being. It can and does exist of an exemplary modality of a type of necessity or contingency in relation to works of its kind and in relation to being. And it can and does exist of a type of exemplary quality of limitation or negation or reality in relation to works of its kind and being. These relationships between the intellectual, rational dimension of the meaningful thought and the being and/or the boundary are observable, measurable, and therefore interpretable. B. 216. The intellectual, sensory, emotional connection between the product of the sublime, meaningful thought and the being and/or the boundary maintains a sublime, emotional/sensory relationship that, on the way to its harmonious pole, causes calm, fulfillment, pain relief, enlightenment, and transcendence. On the other hand, the distancing of the sublime, meaningful thought from the boundary and/or the being creates a feeling of unease, pain, depression, or perhaps indifference that is combined in a sensory, physical, and an emotional, intellectual way. B. 217. The sensory intellectual connection of the meaningful thought with the absorbed and new old being is not measurable or identifiable, unlike the rational emotional connection, but rather for interpretive evaluation only. On the one hand, it involves elements common to all observers and is the elements of their a priori natural senses, and on the other hand, it involves individual, understandable elements known only to them, if at all, of both the intellectual and physical level of sensation. B.218. Therefore, it can be determined that the interpretive dealing with the way of processing intellectual rational absorption by thought deserves a careful and partial rational expansion also regarding the intellectual sensory processing that takes place in meaningful thought. B.219. Meaningful thought operates in a manner of sensory absorption and intellectual and intellectual sensory processing, both through the rational a priori platform and through the intellectual sensory a priori platform. B.220. The intellectual sensory a priori platform includes the a priori forms of pain, joy, and the middle form, peace. B.221. In everything with consciousness, the intellectual sensory a priori forms exist that do not require experimentation for their very existence. B.222. From the fact that the possessor of consciousness is something that is material and lacking by definition, and has consciousness of that lack, there necessarily arises a mental feeling of pain as a lack that seeks completion towards tranquility, and joy as an excess that seeks completion towards tranquility. Both pain and joy strive in their essence, in their fundamental form, for tranquility, which is the intellectual sensory integration with the being that the possessor of consciousness will never truly reach and to which his inherent aspiration is. B.223. The theory of rational and faith-rational meaning differs from the theory of Buddhism, since it does not seek to alleviate pain per se. It combines sensory processing with rational processing for the purpose of sensory-rational integration with existing being, in contrast to the need for sensory self-satisfaction as the main purpose of alleviating suffering pain. B.224. The theory of meaning seeks to integrate with being and/or the limit through both intellectual rational and sensory creation, which changes the previous being and creates a new old, higher being. B.225. The degree of pain and the degree of joy in the rational and/or faith-rational theory of meaning cannot be measured since they involve personal components of the conscious thing that is different from any other conscious thing. B.226. At the same time, there are categorical components in relation to the three a priori forms of sensory reason, which are common to all conscious things by their very essence. B.227. In every pain there is also joy, and in every joy there is also pain, since the conscious thing is lacking by definition compared to the whole of being or God, who is beyond it and includes it. B.228. Therefore, every joy contains within itself a certain dimension of pain, of the absence of joy, or its inherent reduction, and every pain contains within itself a certain dimension of the absence of pain, of some joy. B.229. When we see something, we feel some pain or joy towards it, but certainly there are things whose sight creates unbearable pain or a kind of ecstasy like joy in all things with consciousness. B.230. Pain in relation to peace is in the form of a feeling of lack, and joy is in the form of a feeling of excess. B.231. These and these lead within the framework of the highest meaningful thought to harmony with being in the form of peace, of security in existence in being, of peace with what exists in being, between the thing with consciousness and itself, and being and/or with the boundary. B.232. It can be said that a sight that creates unbearable pain is a sight that creates unbearable lack, and vice versa. A sight of physical or mental fulfillment regarding a great personal lack creates great joy to the point of ecstasy. B.233. The same applies to the other senses. An unbearable smell, an unbearable taste, an unbearable sound, an unbearable physical sensation, an unbearable mental sensation compared to a smell, sound, taste, physical sensation, and mental sensation that bring the person with consciousness to ecstasy. B.234. It can be said that the poles of pain and joy in relation to a specific case are personal subjective in relation to each and everything with consciousness in a different way, as opposed to their very existence, which is objective and stems from the very essence of the thing with consciousness. B. 235. And yet, it seems that an objective statement can be made regarding the poles of the intellectual sensory elements and regarding the attachment or distance from them, which is subject to interpretive examination. Namely, the unbearable pain and the supreme ecstasy are certainly related to the deficiencies and excesses in relation to the peaceful intellectual feeling. B. 236. The greater the intellectual sensory deficiency in relation to the peace, the greater the pain. The greater the intellectual emotional excess in relation to the peace, the greater the approach to the ecstatic pole of the intellectual feeling. B. 237. Therefore, it can be said that unbearable pain is the lower limit of pain, while the supreme ecstasy is the upper limit of joy. B. 238. Peace for the purpose of examining the meaningful thought whose purpose is integration with being and/or the boundary, is the filling of the lack and the moderation of the excess that the creation causes to the Creator and the owners of consciousness wherever they are, neither pain nor ecstasy, but calmness. B. 239. In being and/or the boundary in themselves there is no pain or joy, because they have no deficiencies and the intelligence stored in them is perfect by definition. B. 240. Hence, in the intelligent way of integrating with being from a sensory perspective means striving for peace. B. 241. Being in a deterministic or quantum world harbors in itself ceaseless processes of action and reaction, assembly and disassembly, filling and emptying, all of whose essence is reaching a balance, since being in itself is not renewed over the things in it. It is permanent and infinite. B. 242. Reaching complete identification with being, and even more so with the limit, will never occur, and so will reaching absolute peace, by its very definition, and by the very definition of being and/or the relationship to the reality of God. The aspiration to reach them passes in things with consciousness, through the balance between the pain and joy that are inherent in everything with consciousness. B. 243. But not all absence of pain is joy, and not all absence of joy is pain. This and that are their purpose, the peace, the calm, the unity of the complementary sensory-intellectual contrast, in which there is no pain and no joy, but a perfect union with being. Even more so in rational faith in relation to truth and its truth, that is, to God. B. 244. Unlike other teachings, the sensory-intellectual component in meaningful creation is not separated from the intellectual component, but is combined with it. The a priori basis of thought includes the rational basis, and, in combination with the intellectual sensible basis, both of which operate together in an ideal manner in meaningful thought. B. 245. However, as mentioned, the action of rational processing on the a priori basis in interpretive thought differs from its action in meaningful thought by virtue of its being combined with the a priori meaningful basis, which is both intellectual sensible and by virtue of its purpose. That is, the purpose of rational processing in meaningful thought is integration with being through the creation of a new old being, in contrast to its purpose in interpretive thought, which is identification with existing being, which is all things and everything between things. B. 246. Therefore, the a priori elements of intellectual sensible thought during its meaningful operation take on a different character in their very meaningful operation of integration with being and/or with the limit. B. 247. Insofar as it concerns a meaningful thought on the theoretical a priori platform, the meaningful creation is also found in space and time, but its categories now serve to integrate within a new creation and not to identify with existing being. B. 248. Thus, with regard to the categories of the quantity type, which in interpretive thought will operate for the purpose of unity/identification with existing being, from a purpose of the totality of truth that will not be achieved. In the meaningful thought, they will operate for the purpose of multiplicity with regard to the order of existing being in a request for integration with its totality and/or of the limit through the addition of an intelligent sensible creation on top of it. B. 249. Thus, with regard to the categories of the relation type, which will operate in the interpretive thought from a reciprocal influence with regard to the acting being and the acting intellect. In the meaningful thought, the opposite, the acted is the being and the actor is the meaningful thinker. B. 250. This is how things are with regard to cause and effect when interpretive thought seeks to understand being through cause and effect. Declarative thought seeks to create a new being or a new order in being through cause and effect. B. 251. Thus, with regard to substance in case, interpretive thought seeks to act in relation to a specific case from the very essence of truth. Declarative thought seeks to create a specific case from the very essence of will. B. 252. Thus, with regard to modes, interpretive thought seeks to understand objective being and/or the objective limit imposed upon it. Declarative thought is not subject to the laws of being, since it is based on free will and a purpose with which it does not seek to identify. Therefore, it creates a reality that in the eyes of observers is a contingent reality, dependent on the will of the creators. B. 253. Thus, with regard to the possible and the impossible, the presence and absence according to which we understand being and/or the limit in an interpretive manner. These and these differ in our creation in a meaningful way, since reality is the reality that those with will and meaningful thought create out of their free will to integrate with existing existence in a way that creates from the transcendence of a new old existence. B. 254. The same goes for the categories known as the quality type, that reality and negation, that limitation that characterizes interpretive thought does not characterize meaningful thought. The latter creates and is not created, acts and is not acted upon, singularity and not unity that is voluntary and not necessary, between absolute possibility and absolute absence of possibility, between reality and absolute absence. B. 255. The same is also true for the a priori matter in the moral rational platform on which meaningful thought operates out of meaningful creations in relation to what ought to be. Meaningful thought does not seek what is proper, but rather it seeks to integrate with it and thus create a new old existence. B. 256. Therefore, in relation to the forms of rational morality, the semantic thought seeks to create a work about both the I and the thou. B. 257. The semantic matter of the a priori categories of the religious rational thought is different in the relationship between the religious and the interpretive thought. Here, the religious rational meaningful thought seeks to balance the categories derived from the limit that is the unattainable perfection. B. 258. Religious rational meaningful thought in its highest dimension does not require the transcendent beyond recognition, since it is not possible to integrate with the unknowable. B. 259. Religious rational meaningful thought seeks to integrate with those derived from observing the limit between the reality of God and the reality of being. Its aspiration is a balance between individuality and unity, perfect and unattainable happiness and action, between pain and joy and unattainable peace. B. 260. Being in a deterministic or quantum world is a constant given in which things within it change their order, but not their fundamental, atomic, quantum quantity. B. 261. However, finite being was supposed to maintain a state of staticity in laws and fixed things. Since empirically, this state does not exist in being, it is not finite, a matter that is reconciled only with rational belief. B. 262. At the same time, living things, including living things with consciousness, strive in being for balance in relation to their deficiencies, the rational and the sensory. B. 263. The other things that act on them, and the other forces that act on them, receive from them reactions that are all towards balance. Not the strongest survives empirically, but the balanced. B.264. Indeed, from the mechanisms of balance found a priori in the thought of the conscious thing, it emerges that the fundamental action of the rational consciousness strives for a balance between its poles, as the opposite of the complement, a balance between the cause and the surrounding, between the opposite and the complement, between the agent and the acted upon, between individuality and unity, between the public domain and the private domain, between pain and joy, and so on. B.265. Consequently, it can be determined that the rational thought clearly operates from a rational purpose of balancing its a priori elements and their types, simultaneously with the rational sensory thought that operates to balance its a priori elements and their types. B.266. On the other hand, the boundary in rational faith is found in the definition between things and what is between them, being, and the reality of God. B.267. Therefore, the rational meaning derivative of the essence of being is a constant rational thoughtful aspiration for balance between the poles of things, what is between them, and the purposes that operate on rational thought and/or are understood in it as forms and a priori categories. B.268. At the same time, the rational meaning derivative of the existential side of the boundary is the rational thoughtful aspiration for the existential derivatives of the completeness of God's reality. That is, the aspiration for the poles of the categories, forces, and purposes that operate on rational thought for the issue. B.269. Hence, the action of the rational faithful meaning thought necessarily combines an interaction between the a priori elements of theoretical and moral reason and the a priori elements of rational faith. It will strive for a balance between its theoretical and moral intellectual elements and its intellectual sensory elements for harmony with being. At the same time, it will strive towards the poles of its theoretical, moral, and religious intellectual and intellectual sensory elements from the rational faith purpose for harmony with the perfection derived from the essence of the limit. B.270. The meaningful thought operates somewhere in its intellectual, rational dimension, in its theoretical, moral type, and in the rational sensory dimension within their framework, by means of a balance between the extremes of the a priori elements of thought and their type. On the other hand, the meaningful thought operates in its religious intellectual dimension, to extremize towards the extremes of the a priori theoretical and moral and religious elements, simultaneously with the extremization towards the extremes of the a priori elements of thought as a whole. B.271. The meaningful, faithful, rational thought attracts to ecstasy, to pain, to the extremes of its a priori faith intellectual, sensory/intellectual foundations. On the other hand, the meaningful, theoretical, moral, rational thought, in its a priori intellectual sensory foundations, attracts towards peace, the sensory balance for the purposes of integration with being. B.272. The meaningful, faith intellectual thought attracts towards pain and ecstasy, along with its theoretical aspiration for eternal life, for complete freedom, for complete equality, for absolute happiness, for perfect action. On the other hand, the theoretical, moral, rational thought attracts towards a balance between the rights of the individual, which stem from the individual's own property and themselves, and the rights of the entire public domain and themselves. B.273. The rational, meaningful thought attracts to the balance between the cause and the surrounding, while the religious rational thought attracts to the cause. The theoretical, meaningful thought attracts to the balance between the subject and the agent, while the religious rational thought attracts to the agent. The theoretical, rational, meaningful thought attracts to the balance between reality and the opposite, and the religious rational thought attracts to the completeness of reality. The theoretical attracts to the balance between the singularity and the unity, and the religious rational thought attracts to the unity, and so on. B.274. In practice, the theoretical thought operates in a constant struggle between its existential ideological/moral/rational foundations and its religious rational foundations, as well as between its religious rational foundations and themselves. Balance against the extreme, complementary opposition against polarity. B.275. However, since the rational, meaningful faith operates through the meaningful balance of the a priori elements of thought, it necessarily operates both in being and across the border. Therefore, the rational, meaningful faith that is elevated to a new old creation operates through a balance between the aspirations for eternal life, perfect freedom, perfect equality, perfect happiness, and the perfect proper deed. This is the difference between a simple belief in the jealous God that attracts to the sacrifice/offering, and a rational, sermon-like faith that attracts to the cancellation of error and the path of truth in the yoke of God. This is the difference between the belief in the jealous God and the prophet who acts in an extreme manner against the priests of Baal, and the rational faith in Mount Horeb/Bakr that puts him on his error in the spirit. B.276. The equation of balance between the complementary opposition in the meaningful thought that seeks to integrate with being and the polarity in the meaningful thought that seeks to integrate with the boundary leads the believing, rational, meaningful thought to a constant oscillation between the complementary opposition and the extremes, that is, to temporary extremes and opposites to balance upon balance. B.277. The existential intellectual foundations of the rational, meaningful thought draw it towards the balance between the existing and the proper that characterizes being in itself, while its religious intellectual foundations draw it both towards the balance between the ends of the complementary contrast and towards the balance between the existential ends of the categories of wholeness. B.278. But this is not enough. To the rational, meaningful thought, with its aspects and its struggle towards the rational sensory balance, is joined the rational interpretive thought, which seeks in its theoretical/moral/rational essence to identify with being, and, insofar as it is a religious intellectual interpretive one, also with the existential side of the boundary. B.279. And here, a look at the foundations of the theoretical interpretive thought shows that it strives for a truth that will never be achieved. Since the purpose of overall being pulls toward a balance between things and the forces exerted on them, theoretical interpretive thought strives to identify with being's aspiration for balance by processing the perceived being through the edges of its a priori elements in accordance with the perceived being and/or limit. That is, rational interpretive thought operates in a manner of individual identification with a cause or with a surrounding, identification with reality or with absence, identification with singularity or with unity, etc., and creating an interpretation that works to balance them. In other words, theoretical rational meaningful thought pulls toward a balance between its rational, and sensory categorical elements, since its goal is integration with being, whose internal general purpose is necessarily balance, while theoretical rational interpretive thought pulls toward a balance between its rational categorical elements only. B.280. It follows that interpretive/theoretical/rational thought and semantic/theoretical/rational thought have a different purpose and a common denominator. And so do the other types of interpretive and semantic thought, moral rational and religious rational. B.281. Indeed, interpretive and semantic thought are intertwined despite their different purpose, different processing action, and different result. B.282. When interpretive thought seeks to identify with the world, it necessarily creates a new old being, since it does not identify with the world in an absolute way. But this new old being does not seek to change the previous one, but to identify with it. Therefore, this new old being is subject to interpretation for the purpose of correcting it, and so on, until the gap between it and actual being is narrowed, which will never truly close. B. 283. On the other hand, meaningful thought does not strive for truth and creates a new old being in a structured way. This new old being necessarily preserves a dimension for interpretation, since interpretation seeks to identify with being, and vice versa. B. 284. In order to understand the relationship between interpretation and meaning, or the being that creates consciousness, versus the consciousness/will that creates being in their highest meaning, it is appropriate to resort to theoretical extremism. The theoretical extremism is not practical/real, but it is capable of illustrating the constant connection between the two types of thoughts of things with consciousness, and, first and foremost, the highest that we know, the human, the woman, and the man both as an object and as a religious intellectual message. B. 285. Insofar as there was a pure objective interpretation that fully identifies with being, it would be possible to draw an equation within the framework of which interpretation is equal to being. B. 286. In such a case, the higher meaningful thought would seek to integrate with being, that is, with the pure interpretation, through a new creation of a new old being, that is, including the absorbed and the meaningful creation. B. 287. That new old being after the higher meaningful creation would necessarily be subject to interpretation, which, to the extent that it was pure, would be identical to it and subject to a new meaningful thought, and so on. B. 289 wants to say that being in its purest sense is a combination between the higher interpretive thought and the higher meaningful thought. B. 290. In practice, it can be determined that the higher thought holds the culmination of human thought, and hence the culmination of humanity in general, that is, the being that creates consciousness and the consciousness/will that creates being. The peak of humanity is the intellectual ideological peak of thought that upholds the sublime and exemplary being, the moral intellectual peak that upholds its predecessor and the sublime and exemplary morality, and the religious intellectual peak that upholds its predecessors and the sublime and exemplary faith. B. 291. The combination of the interpretive, exemplary, and meaningful thought, the sublime, the religious intellectual meaning, to serve and preserve it in the garden of the rational soul, whose purpose is the worship of God and the preservation of the sublime and exemplary faith through eternal reason. B. 292. Both types of human thought share the element of free will. B. 293. In interpretive thought, free will is what motivates the very act of absorption and processing for the purposes of identification. On the one hand, the choice of thought as a curatorial interpretation necessarily imposes an imposition of objective being on the process of processing and its product. On the other hand, in the meaningful thought, the free will is what drives the absorption and processing, but also the creation itself. That is, it forces the creation of the meaningful thought on the previous being. To the extent that the free will's choice is to act in the superior rational meaningful thought, it forces its creation on the previous being in a way that seeks to change it. B. 294. Therefore, it can be stated that the meaningful thought is never objective and cannot be predicted in advance. It combines will, reason, and senses together. B. 295. It can also be stated that within the meaningful thought there is a constant struggle, the decision of which is not known in advance, between its ideological moral foundations and its religious rational foundations. B. 296. It can also be stated that in the rational faithful meaning thought, there is a struggle between its elements that attract to the rational sensual pole and its elements that attract to the irrational sensual pole. B. 297. Thus there is a constant struggle between the elements of the rational faithful meaning thought that attract to an intellectual and sensual unipolarity, and the interpretive theoretical elements of the rational faithful thought that attract to a balanced bipolarity, both rational and sensual. B. 298. This matter can be likened to a dream of Jacob's ladder, with ends on one side in the earth, that is, in being, and on the other side in the sky, that is, in the boundary on its existential side, and angels descend and ascend on it. B. 299. At the same time, there is a constant struggle in meaningful thought within its faith intellectual elements among themselves, that is, between the attraction to the ends of the boundary on the existential side and the attraction to what is on the other side of the boundary, which is not subject to human knowledge. This is the struggle between rational faith that seeks the ends in relation to the existential side of a boundary, and mystical faith that seeks what is beyond the boundary in a way that is fundamentally wrong. B. 300. Both the rational faithful and rational being rational meaningful element draw meaningful thought toward transcendence, as opposed to mystical meaningful thought that draws it to madness, just as it draws interpretive, rational faithful thought to great error. B. 301. The reason for this is, as stated, since the sublime meaningful thought seeks to integrate with the being or the limit that it perceives, and cannot integrate at all with what is not subject to recognition. B. 302. At the same time, and as explained above, the constant relations of the meaningful thought to its issue with the interpretive thought to its issue necessarily draw it, on the one hand, toward balance in being, and balance against and between the extremes derived from the limit, and on the other hand, toward distancing itself from mystical, irrational thought and their implications. B. 303. The result of this is that the culmination of human thought in exemplary interpretive thought that advances to the path of truth that will never be achieved is always halfway between the feet of the ladder and its upper ends. At the same time, the culmination of human thought in meaningful, rational, and sublime thought that seeks to create a new old sublime being through rational intellectual integration that seeks rational balance between its elements and its object, and intellectual sensory integration that seeks peace in the face of the old being or the border. B. 304. The decision regarding the method of action for the purpose of balance and peace of meaningful creation depends on the free will and the conceptual and material ability of the conscious thing that acts meaningfully. B. 305. A meaningful work in which the intellectual sensory component is strong and the intellectual rational component is low is a meaningful work that is superior in a reduced way, compared to a meaningful work in which both the intellectual emotional and intellectual rational elements are closely related. Both are required for its maximum integration with being, or the boundary, that is, the creation of a new old being, different or in a different order of being, which is in harmony with what preceded it. B. 306. A meaningful work that does not have an intellectual component, such as ignoring the a priori intellectual rational foundations of thought for its subject, is a poor, non-high meaningful work. B. 307. A meaningful work that does not have a sensory component, such as ignoring the a priori sensory rational foundations of thought, is a non-high creation. B. 308. The reasons for this are derived from the very definition of rational meaningful thought as a combination of feeling and reason towards the creation of a new, old being that harmoniously combines the creation and the being that preceded it. B. 309. A sublime theoretical/moral meaningful creation is a creation in which a balance exists between its a priori rational and sensory elements in relation to being. B. 310. A sublime faith-rational meaningful creation is a creation in which the above balance exists, as well as a constant struggle against the attraction to intellectual sensory polarity, or to what is beyond the limit, with the purpose of integrating with the rational faith categories of being and the limit. B. 311. A sublime, meaningful creation is revealed from the meaningful creation itself, and not from the consideration of the intention of its creator that is not possible to absorb. B.312. The consideration of the nobility of the meaningful creation is a thought of the type of interpretation. B.313. Unlike interpretation, there is no meaning that is true in itself, but a meaning that is higher than others. B.314. Everything and everything between things and the border has a meaning. B.315. Thought about reality that is beyond recognition is not a higher meaning and is not interpretation in the way of truth, because there is no ability to identify and or harmonize with what is beyond recognition, and no ability to feel truly actually as integration with what is beyond the possibility of feeling. B.316. Meaning is the creation of thought about thought that seeks to integrate with being and the border through the a priori elements of intellectual rational and sensory rational thought. B.317. Interpretation is the creation of thought about the world and the border with which it seeks to identify through the a priori elements of intellectual rational thought. B.318. The higher meaning is infinite. B.319. Interpretation in the way of truth is one. B.320. Everything in the world and everything between things and the border has a higher meaning because every thought has an observation processing that seeks to integrate intellectually and emotionally with being and or the border, and thus create a new old being. B.321. The more deeply the meaning integrates with being through its a priori intellectual and sensory elements of the thought of all individuals together, the more it will be shared and more generally interpretable with respect to others. B.322. A meaningful, theoretical, moral thought is higher in the sense that it integrates with being through the absorption of existing being and its processing in a way that strives for balance between the poles of its a priori intellectual and sensory elements and the creation of a new meaningful product that is added to the being that is absorbed and creates a being with it. A will that creates being versus a being that creates consciousness. B.323. A meaningful, faith-rational thought is sublime in the sense that it integrates with being through its absorption and the absorption of the limit from the existential side through a struggle between the a priori, intellectual, and sensory radical elements of rational faith, which together with the meaningful ideological and moral balance strive for a meaningful faith-rational balance and peace. B.324. Interpretive thought is thought that seeks to maintain unity with being through identification/fusion/clothing by the a priori elements of thought for its subject, with natural and abstract things, and what is in between in being and/or, with abstract things and what is in between on the border of its existential side until its refutation. B.325. Sublime, rational, faith-based, meaningful thought, without a balance of theoretical, moral, meaningful thought, is liable to lead to a disconnection from its rational foundations and even to a deviation towards what is beyond the border, which is necessarily low, meaningful thought. B.326. Sublime, rational, meaningful thought, without an exemplary, rational, faith-based interpretation of it, is liable to lead to erroneous and disastrous interpretive conclusions. B.327. Thus, the story of the Akeda, which originates from a lofty, rational, and religiously meaningful thought, without an exemplary interpretation, is liable to lead to a great error, a rational religious disaster, a moral disaster, and an existential physical disaster. The same is true for the parable of the plagues of Egypt in the face of Moses striking the rock. The same is true for the story of the Israelites' revenge on the Midianites, and more. B.328. Meaning is created in language and words by thought in the manner of a meaningful description or meaningful creation. B.329. A meaningful description or creation is made through the intellectual, and sensory elements of thought for a given issue. B. 330. The interpretation is determined by thought in the manner of an interpretive description or interpretive explanation. B. 331. An interpretive description or explanation is made through the intellectual elements alone of thought for a given issue. B. 332. The a priori intellectual elements of thought vary from one type of thought to another, ideological, moral, faith-based, but the sensory elements themselves are constant for all types of thought, unlike the difference between the emphasis on balance and polarity in their operation. B. 333. Exemplary science is thoughts and actions of the type of interpretation. B. 334. Exemplary scientists are interpreters. B. 335. True scientific work is an exemplary theoretical intellectual interpretation, both abstract and natural, which seeks identification with things, natural and/or abstract, and what is in between. B. 336. The arts that are elevated to their types are thoughts and actions of the type of meaning. B. 337. Artists are signifiers. B. 338. A sublime artistic creation is a thought and action of a meaning type that seeks harmony with the world or with the limit through identification with the a priori elements of rational thought and the senses that are expressed in a material act. B. 339. The exemplary logical philosophy is thoughts and actions of an interpretation type. B. 340. The exemplary rational morality is understood through thoughts and actions of an interpretation type and actions according to them, but since from the point of view of man it is very complex and specific to each action, in practice it maintains a combination between an interpretation that strives for the path of truth and a sublime, meaningful intuition that is subordinate to this interpretation. B. 341. The exemplary philosophers are interpreters. B. 342. An exemplary philosophical creation is a metaphysical/rational/rational moral/rational thought that seeks to identify with the moral/metaphysical dimension of natural and abstract things and what is in between. B. 343. Rational faith is both lofty thoughts of the type of meaning and exemplary thoughts of the type of interpretation and actions according to them. B. 344. On the one hand, in terms of the relation of the religious rational thought to the theoretical and moral dimension in it, it is a relation that is fundamentally interpretive, since it seeks to identify with what is present and appropriate in existence. B. 345. On the other hand, the relation of the religious rational thought to the limit is combined. With its existential side, it seeks to identify, and with its divine side that is associated with it, it cannot identify because its reality is beyond recognition and being and contains them. B. 346. Therefore, the religious rational thought necessarily operates in a combined manner, seeking an exemplary interpretation in the face of what is present and proper in being and at the boundary on its existential side, and seeking a sublime meaning, both sensory and rational, in the face of what is present and proper in being and at the boundary on its existential side, which is bound together with the unattainable divine reality. B. 347. At the same time, the religious rational thought seeks an exemplary interpretation regarding the creation of the new, religious, rational being that is created due to the combination between the interpretation and the previous being, and the addition of the sublime, meaningful, religious, rational creation on top of it, and so on. B. 348. The contemplation of the culmination of the rational faith in being, and at the boundary, combines somewhere between the sublime meaning and the exemplary interpretation. This observation is expressed in the foundations of faith through various spoken words in their forms, such as face to face, the path of God, Jehovah God, the internal struggle between the existential foundation of the rational believer and his religious elevation, such as the conceptual practical struggle between Jacob and the man until Jacob's transformation into Israel and beyond. B. 349. The prophets are both interpreters and interpreters. The sages are both thinking and acting interpreters. The priests are acting and thinking interpreters. The rulers are acting interpreters. B. 350. The prophecies that are elevated to their types are thoughts and actions of a type of lofty meaning and exemplary interpretation, both in relation to being and the boundary both. These thoughts and actions are expressed in the idea and deed that is appropriate for the work of God, which is conceptual practical work according to the development of faith rationality, meaning interpretation, and interpretive preservation. It is possible to distinguish between the various prophets in a faith-rational way in a different relationship between their meaningful activity, such as revelation, and their interpretive activity, such as explaining the revelation or the commandments derived from it, etc. Sometimes the relationship is between a central and profound revelation and minimal interpretation, and sometimes the opposite, between minimal revelation and profound exemplary interpretation. The faith-rational golden path for the prophets runs through sublime, meaningful thought and exemplary interpretive thought in relation to it and to the existence and/or the boundary that precedes and follows it, one for one. For the priests, the faith-rational golden path runs between the conceptual interpretation and the practical executive interpretation of the prophecy. For the sages, the path runs between the conceptual interpretation and the practical executive interpretation in relation to the prophecy. For the rulers, the golden path of faith intellect runs between the conceptual interpretation of the sages and priests and their own and the sages' practical interpretation of the public. B.351 Objective interpretation is a mental creation that seeks to identify with being and/or with the boundary, from a rational exemplary fusion with them through language. B.352 Subjective interpretation is a mental creation that seeks to identify with being and/or with the boundary, not through a rational exemplary fusion with them, for example, through the senses, or that seeks to merge in one way or another with God. B. 353. In fact, subjective interpretation is a meaningful action and not an interpretive one, but it is not a lofty, meaningful thought, since it does not operate in a rational sensory manner, for a lofty integration with being and/or with the boundary. B.354. At the same time, since every interpretation does not actually maintain full identity with being, much less with the boundary, and there is no pure objective interpretation in the hands of man, it can be argued that every interpretation has one or another meaningful dimension. Even an interpretation that seeks to identify in an exemplary manner with being or the boundary actually also works with the intellectual sensory elements and/or creates a creation that integrates with the perceived being and does not fully identify with it. B.355. A sublime meaning is a mental creation that seeks and works in a sublime manner, for harmony with the world/being and/or with the boundary, through the a priori elements of the intellectual, sensory thought of its subject. B.356. A non-sublime meaning is a mental creation that does not seek to be in harmony with the world/being and/or with the boundary and/or that does not seek to create a meaningful creation through the combined a priori elements of reason and the senses into the subject of active thought. B.357. Interpretive and meaningful thought. Process the absorption of being and/or the boundary through language, an individual and/or external collaborative mental interior, although their product is expressed in different and diverse ways. B.358. A basic combination in a language can and does receive a different meaning in the same language, according to an internal change in the order of combination between the a priori elements in it. But for each combination in itself, And in relation to all combinations, and being/the boundary, there will be one and only objective interpretation. B.359. In alphabetic languages, descriptive and interpretive explanations will always consist of sentences, and never just one word. B.360. Interpretive sentences in alphabetic languages are always combinations of elementary words in the language, and words that represent some relationship between the non-descriptive and non-explanatory pictorial words. B.361. An interpretive sentence in alphabetic languages is always either descriptive interpretive combinations or explanatory combinations of elementary elements in the language. B.362. A word in itself in an alphabetic language, and even a letter, can be a basis for a meaningful description, or a meaningful creation, or be a meaningful creation in itself. B.363. Sentences in alphabetic languages are divided into analytic sentences, complex sentences, and sentences that are both analytic and complex. B.364. Therefore, according to Kant, two additional types of sentences must be seen, which are the a priori sentence, whose truth is not based on the senses, and the a posteriori sentence, whose truth is based on the experience of the senses. B.365. Hence, according to Kant, an analytic sentence can and does be a priori. A synthetic sentence can and does be a posteriori. An analytic sentence cannot be a posteriori. And his great innovation is that a synthetic sentence can and does be a priori. B.366. But to this distinction, two additional components must be added, stemming from the division between interpretive sentences versus meaningful sentences. B.367. This distinction corrects Kant again, and this time from a starting point of purely theoretical rational criticism. B.368. In a world where only interpretive thought exists, an analytic sentence cannot be a posteriori, since its truth is learned from it. B.369. However, in an existence where meaningful thought exists, the conclusion is different. When we observe an analytic interpretive sentence, we must examine whether it has different semantic meanings that create a contradiction with its interpretive meaning. B.370. This observation differs from the criticism of analytic philosophy regarding this distinction from the meanings given to the components of the sentence in language, which can be different in different contexts. B.371. In this respect, every analytic sentence is also an a posteriori sentence for examining a different semantic possibility for its subject, and its subject that creates a contradiction with respect to its interpretive meaning. B.372. For example, the expression, "the bachelors are not married," does not necessarily maintain semantic identity between the word bachelors and the expression, "are not married." B.373. The word single has different meanings that can contradict the meanings of the expression, "not married," and are derived, for example, from their different roots. I can rationally feel something different about "not married," and create from this a different meaning that contradicts the creation that stems from my rational feeling for the word single. For example, the term single in Hebrew can create in me a rational feeling of emptiness, of lack, while the expression "not married" of well-being, and therefore the equation is not necessarily the same from an interpretive point of view that takes into account the possibility of a linguistic difference in meaning. B.374. On the other hand, the sentence, "In the word single there is the letter resh," is an interpretive descriptive sentence that does have different meanings in relation to its subject and its marriage, but these do not contradict the connection between the two. Even if I rationally feel something different about the letter resh and create some creation from this, this does not contradict its existence in the word single. B.375. Hence, even in an analytical sentence from an interpretive point of view, we must examine whether there is a possible contradiction between its interpretive meaning and its possible interpretive semantic meaning. B.376. B.376. Therefore, sentences that maintain an interpretation or meaning are divided into their analytical types, which are complex and integrated into the whole of human thought. B.377. Sentences that maintain an apparently objective, rational interpretation are divided into their types in relation to the whole of human thought in a way that seeks to maintain identification between them and their object in being through the a priori elements of thought in their types. B.378. Sentences that maintain a higher rational meaning are divided into their types in relation to the whole of human thought in a way that seeks to maintain harmony with being through the a priori elements of rational and sensory thought. B.379. The non-descriptive and non-explanatory pictorial combinations in language are indifferent to issues of truth. B.380. The descriptive and explanatory interpretive combinations always move between a subjective pole and an objective pole, that is, between description and explanation, that have a logically proven mental identity with the being that is perceived until its refutation, and description and explanation that have no logically proven identity between the things and what is between them. B.381. The descriptive and creative meaningful combinations in language always move between a low creative pole and a high creative pole. They move between description and creation that have a deep harmony with natural and/or abstract things and what is between them, and an exemplary use of the general a priori elements of thought, and a meaningful description and creation that have no harmony with being and do not have an exemplary use of the a priori elements of thought. B.382. The lowest and highest poles of meaningful thought are not in themselves interpretable in the way of truth, since meaningful thought is not concerned with the search for truth and is fundamentally concerned with the freedom of the will and its influence on existence, which cannot be truly defined and quantified, neither in their full essence nor in their absolute absence. B.383. The descriptive and pictorial combinations in language are divided into interpretive combinations that seek to maintain objectivity in the definition, although they are never fully objective. The car moves at a speed of 10 kilometers per hour. And semantic combinations in the definition that are never objective. The table is beautiful. B.384. The combinations that maintain descriptive and interpretive explanations of the descriptive and pictorial combinations in language seek to maintain objectivity in the definition of identification with things in existence, although they will never be fully objective in definition. B.385. The combinations that maintain interpretive explanations of the descriptive or creative semantic combinations seek to maintain identification with things in the new existence that is a combination between the existence that preceded the description/creation of meaning and the one that follows the description/creation of meaning. B.386. The descriptive or creative semantic combinations in themselves are not. They maintain objectivity and subjectivity in the sense of truth and falsehood, and they move between transcendence and the absence of transcendence. For example, I saw a beautiful bird, the bird saw me, as a meaningful creation with extensive depth and weight, versus the beautiful bird as a meaningful description with low depth and weight. B.387. In contrast, the combinations that maintain descriptions and meaningful creations that are not sublime seek by definition not to operate through the a priori elements of intellectual sensory thought and/or with the a priori elements of rational intellectual thought and/or do not operate for the sake of integration/harmony of being and/or the boundary. For example, the bird speaks beautifully. B.388. Language. Divided between descriptions and explanations of interpretation of what is said in language, moves somewhere between an infinite subjective pole and one objective pole that it will never reach in full. B.389. Language. Divided between descriptions and meaningful creations of what is said in language, moves somewhere between a lower pole and a higher pole that never have an end and an end. B.390. Language moves between its a priori natural elements, about which there is no dispute until they are refuted, and their combinations, the interpretation of which moves between an infinite subjective pole and one and only objective pole, and between infinite low and high meaning. B.391. Every descriptive/explanatory combination of the a priori elements of language regarding the understanding of being and or the limit that are absorbed by thought passes by definition into its interpretative aspects. B.392. Any descriptive/creative combination of the a priori elements of language regarding harmony/integration with being absorbed by thought passes by definition into its semantic aspects. B.393. A philosophical effort that claims that there are no abstract things, or that it is appropriate to remain silent about something in the world, or about something derived from something in the world, or that an identity must be maintained between language and the absorption of thought, and not between thought and the absorption of thought, is a philosophical effort that is wrong by definition. B.394. A distinction must be made between silence and muting, and between recognition of the limitations of cognition. So with regard to God, so with regard to the consciousness and desire of each person, with regard to each person, so with regard to the freedom of the will, and so with regard to the lack of possibility of absolute identification with being and with the limit. B.395. Recognition of a person's limitations does not eliminate his aspiration to know the truth, but on the contrary, it spurs him towards his purpose in an exemplary way that will never be fully achieved. B.396. Meaning in relation to being, natural or abstract things, and or a limit can also be expressed in a way of feeling without language, or in a subconscious way without language, or in a conscious way of thinking through language. B.397. The individual's conclusion regarding being and or the limit that is rational and strives for the objective will be made consciously and voluntarily through language, through combinations between its elements in a descriptive and or explanatory way. B.398. A rational conclusion that strives for objectivity regarding a meaning or interpretation given by another individual through language is always a combination of a voluntary, rational observation of the interpreting individual on general being and or the boundary, and an observation of the sentences created by the other individual in relation to being. B.399. Observation that strives for objectivity is never an observation of the thought of the interpreting or addressee individual per se, but rather of the product of his thought and action. B.400. Every inferential observation by an individual on any sentence, as distinct from a meaningful observation, involves some dimension of interpretation. B.401. The interpretation of an expression in language is divided into a subjective interpretation that has infinite possibilities, and in practice is of low significance and not a real interpretation, and an objective interpretation that is final, single, and unattainable by man. B.402. Language moves between its natural, a priori elements and their combinations, whose interpretation moves between an infinite subjective pole and a single objective pole. B.403. The interpretation of an expression is the product of thought about the parts of thought that receive expression through language, and which are combinations of the a priori elements in language. B.404. The expression in language that is subject to interpretation is not identical to the thought that created it. B.405. There is no possibility for one person to know what another person's thought is. B.406. There is no possibility for a person to know in an absolute way what his own thought is, which is composed of parts that are visible and hidden to his consciousness, and whose components are things, and what is in between them in billions. B.407. There is no possibility of interpreting an expression that is subject to interpretation except in relation to itself, as a given found in existence, and not in relation to the thought that created it. B.408. Interpretation of an expression is an interpretation of the natural and abstract things and what is in between that are inherent in the expression and necessarily in their relation to all things and what is in between. B.409. Interpretation of an expression involves absorption, processing, and thesis, and then antithesis, and then synthesis, and so on, due to the lack of possibility of reaching the absolute objectivity of understanding the expression, or of understanding what is present and/or appropriate, and/or the meaningful creation that the expression seeks to express. B.410. Subjective interpretation, in the sense of an expression in language, is in fact an expression of the interpreter's own language, whose common elements with the thoughts of other people are not achieved by means of rational proof/refutation. B.411. Objective interpretation of an expression in a structured language is in fact an expression of common a priori combinations of language by way of rational intellectual proof/refutation that maintains an unrefuted rational identification between the mind of the person who perceives the expression and the elements of the expression against the overall framework of the expression, against the relation of the expression, against all expressions in the world, and against the relation between the expression with its specific components and rules and being and/or the boundary. B.412. The objective interpretation of an expression in a language is an empirical, rational, and exemplary identification with the expression and with the object in being towards which it is envisioned as seeking identification, as an interpretive expression, or harmony, as a meaningful expression, by processing its absorption on the a priori platform of thought. B.413. The descriptive and/or explanatory expression in itself is not identical to the thought of its creator, and hence is not identical to the creator's absorption of being, nor to the processing of absorption by him, and therefore does not teach in itself about anything in the world. B.414. On the other hand, examining the relationship between the expression within itself and its components, in relation to all the expressions in the world, and between them and being and/or the boundary, in a rational, intelligent manner of proof/refutation, is what gives it a meaning that approaches the objective pole and moves away from the subjective pole of human interpretive thought. B.415. The natural rational interpretation is the product of the absorption by the human mind of what is perceived as existing in existence, and their mental, conscious, voluntary processing on the a priori theoretical platform of reason through descriptive and explanatory combinations, for the purpose of identification with natural and/or abstract things and what is in between them, that is, the natural existent. B.416. The moral rational interpretation is the product of the absorption by the human mind of what is perceived as existing in existence and/or the expressions in relation to this, and the possibilities given for voluntary free action in relation to that existent, and their mental, conscious, voluntary processing on the a priori moral and theoretical platform of thought, through descriptive and explanatory combinations in language, for understanding what is appropriate to do between the possibilities of action and/or between the things that have free will and/or between them and the things in the existing world, that is, the burden of human morality. The combination between human thought and his interpretive exemplary action for his thought and his meaningful action elevated in being is the status of man before being. B.417. The religious rational interpretation is the product of the absorption by human thought of what is perceived as existing in being and the boundary between it and the reality of God beyond it, and/or the expressions in relation to this, and the possibilities given for voluntary free action in relation to that existing, and their voluntary conscious processing on the a priori religious, moral, ideological platform of reason, through the descriptive and/or explanatory combinations of language, for understanding the natural and/or abstract things in the being of being and what is between them, and the boundary between it and the reality beyond it, God. That is, the burden of Torah and religious rational commandments. B.418. The exemplary rational religious interpretation of being and the boundary, together with the supreme rational religious meaning, are the way to the existence of man's status before God. Being creates consciousness, and consciousness creates being, to serve and preserve it, or in other words, man's status before God. B.419. Pure theoretical rational thought in the matter of proof or refutation, in the sense of absorbing logical identification in language, in relation to the observation of the existing world, as images or as an abstraction on the a priori foundations of theoretical thought and its categorical foundations, creates one thought, objectivity, truth for its time, that is necessarily common to all human thought by its very nature and definition, until its refutation. B.420. Pure rational moral thought creates a rational moral identity in language, with what should be within the framework of the pure existing. This thought is always between things, and what is between them and other things in existence, and it is carried out in language through elemental combinations, and descriptive and/or explanatory combinations that are created through the thought's absorption of things in existence and what is between them. B.421. After the pure theoretical absorption of the possibilities of action, comes the stage of its pure moral processing on the theoretical and moral a priori platform, and its issuance as a moral conclusion/fact through expression in language that includes natural or abstract elemental combinations and their relationship with other elemental combinations, and combinations in language that are explanatory and/or descriptive and/or abstract in a way that the pure rational morality of human thought cannot help but accept. That is, that it confirms or proves or refutes a previous moral logical identification. B.422. Pure moral rational thought in the matter of proof or refutation is the absorption of the logical identification made in relation to the thought's observation of the proper being through language. After absorption, the rational moral thought processing works towards a single moral rational conclusion, to objectivity, to a moral truth for its time, in relation to the specific, unique object, and at the same time necessarily common to all exemplary human thought by its very nature and definition until its refutation. After the moral rational conclusion comes the stage of the voluntary decision to act. B.423. Pure rational faithful thought is identification through language with what is proper to be in the faith rational state. It is the world between things and what is between them and other things in being, and between them and the boundary between being and the reality of God. Pure rational faith thought operates through language by assembling basic combinations of images and descriptions and/or explanations that are created through mental absorption of things and what is between them in being and regarding the boundary on the existential side. B.424. After the faith absorption comes the stage of processing it on the theoretical, moral, and faith a priori platform together, and issuing it as a rational faith fact/conclusion. The rational faith fact is expressed in language through natural or abstract basic combinations and their explanatory and/or descriptive relationship with respect to other basic combinations in a way that the pure rational faith of human thought cannot help but accept them. That is, that it confirms or proves or refutes in an exemplary manner a rational faith belief identification that is given and is even obligated in itself to an exemplary refutation, and so on. Ideally, after the pure faith rational conclusion through language, comes the stage of deciding on the pure faith rational action. B.425. The pure religious rational thought in the matter of proof or refutation is a logical identification in language in relation to the possibilities of what is and is appropriate in the world and at the limit of its existential side, in relation to a given case and a decision for exemplary action accordingly. Religious rational thought operates in a manner of absorbing the options of choice as images, and what is between them and other images, and what is between them, and processing them into a general conclusion/fact of the existing and concerning the options of choice in the view on the a priori theoretical, moral, and religious foundations of thought and its integrated categorical foundations. This exemplary faith-rational processing creates an aspiration for a single, objective, faith-rational thought, for recognizing and acting according to the faith-rational proper, which is a faith-rational truth for its time, correct for a specific case examined by it, and at the same time necessarily common to all exemplary human thought, by its very nature and definition, that can be refuted and is even obligated to a faith-rational and exemplary refutation, and so on. B.426. The descriptive and explanatory combinations in language are the means of human thought for interpreting being and/or the limit on its existential side, but they are not in themselves identical, neither to human thought, nor to being, nor to the limit. B.427. Any attempt to draw conclusions about being from language itself as a kind of interpretive thought about language from language, which ignores the foundation of thought outside of language about language, constitutes a fundamental error that is contrary by definition to the essence of language, man, being, and/or what is beyond it and includes it and is not definable. B.428. Every language element or combination of language elements that are perceived as lacking meaning in language itself are by definition meaningful in that they were not created out of nothing and in themselves, but from man's thought, will, and development, and in that they serve as a means for combinations in language, including as a means for combinations that maintain an interpretation of the world, including language itself. B.429. Being as the world of being creates consciousness in man, of which he is a part, and is composed of the totality of things, and what is between them in past, present, and future times in the world of being, or, in other words, of everything in man and everything outside man. B.430. The totality of facts is the totality of descriptions and/or rational exemplary explanations of man for what was, what is, and what will be in being, and for what should be in man's position vis-a-vis being or vis-a-vis God. B.431. Man creates a new old being solely by his free choice in action. B.432. Being creates awareness that is the product of absorbing thought as part of being, which operates after absorbing natural and/or abstract things and what is in between. B.433. The totality of descriptions and explanations is not the same as the totality of things and what is in between. B.434. The totality of descriptions and explanations, that is the totality of facts, is never the same as being as it is established by it through language, which by definition does not include thought but is included in it. The thought that creates language and uses it is part of being and is shaped by it, except for the free will of the owner of consciousness, which does not determine facts but initiates the creation of things and what is in between. B.435. The a priori elements of language are in themselves a thought of a meaning type. The pictorial elements in language are in themselves a thought of a meaning type. B.436. The explanations and/or descriptions in language that seek to identify with things and what is in between them and/or with the boundary on its existential side are a thought of an interpretation type. B.437. Language is a means both for the owner of consciousness to desire rational sensory harmony with being and/or the boundary, that is, meaning, and for his desire to identify with being and, slash, or the boundary, that is, interpretation. B.438. Language does not stand in itself in the aspiration to identify with being. B.439. The facts are not the world/nature/being. B.440. Theoretical/moral/faithful meaning is rational and sensual thought through language about being, and the latter also about the border from the existential hunt. The meaning is created by those who have meaningful thought out of a purpose of harmony with being, and the latter with the border on its existential side through the a priori elements of rational sensual thought for the subject and through language. B.441. Theoretical/moral/faithful rational interpretation is thought about the world, and the latter also about the border that seeks through language to identify with being, and the latter also with the border on its existential side through the a priori elements of rational thought for the subject. B.442. Formal interpretive understanding, PhD, identifies with being in a descriptive manner, in accordance with the types of thought. Substantive interpretive understanding, Daresh, identifies with being and slash or the boundary on its existential side in an explanatory manner, in accordance with the types of thought. B.443. The more formal interpretive understanding seeks and works to understand the PhD and the Desh through exemplary identification with respect to the specific object perceived and with respect to being and slash or the boundary on its existential side, including all the PhD and all the Desh regarding them in being and slash or with respect to the boundary on its existential side. The closer its interpretation brings it to being and to the boundary on its existential side. B.444. In the critique of pure rational faith, the union of the exemplary interpretation and the sublime meaning and the voluntary decision to act according to them is the pure union of the being that creates consciousness with the consciousness that creates being. This union is the eternal shoot that comes forth as the righteousness of Jehovah God from the stem of Jesse as the believing natural being. It is a pure spirit of life that comes forth from the previous Torah in the believing rational being towards the new, sublime, and exemplary Torah, or, more precisely, the new old again and again and again. B.445. The union of the exemplary interpretation and the sublime meaning into the whole of the product of the exemplary fact and the sublime creation, and at the same time the decision to act according to and towards them, is the highest manifestation of human thought. This union exists in its most exemplary and sublime manifestation only in the highest rational faith.